Hi everybody, I am so delighted to be here with Heidi James, who I have interviewed before, as some of you may remember, and weirdly, when we met that time, we actually talked about language and the story being a kind of mirror to what it means to be human. So I'm quite excited to have her back now to talk about The Sound Mirror, this absolutely fabulous book which is out this month. It is the Republic of Consciousness Book of the Month. It's on the Not the Booker long list, and if you haven't, you can vote for it soon, like very soon. She has several other novels out there. So the Dogs was the Sunday Times Crime Book of the Month. Wounding is also an absolutely fabulous book that if you haven't read, you must read. The Mesmerist Daughter won the Saboteur Award for Best Novella. She's award-winning for poetry, for short stories. Basically, she can do everything, and it's just brilliant that she's here. Heidi, for people who don't know about the book, can you just tell us a little bit about The Sound Mirror?
Anyway, hello, thank you for that lovely introduction. There's lots of things I can't do, but so The Sound Mirror it's 3 generations of women. It's about 4 women, but one of them is a ghost almost. Like, she's very present, but she has no real voice. And it's about these 3 generations of women, 2 grandmothers, the mother and the daughter, and how their choices, which implies a kind of freedom, but of course there isn't a freedom. Our choices are always contingent on situation, class, location, time. You know, it's always political in scale. So it's about them and how they interact with one another, and how their choices impact and resonate and continue to echo, which is kind of, you know, the sound rippling out. But it's narrated. One of the characters is narrated by almost like her mitochondrial DNA, like by all the mothers that have ever come before. Because there's something for me about trauma on the grand scale, on a smaller scale, that women's lives have been curtailed and funneled and, you know, just so limited in so many ways and silenced, that these echoes continue. So it's sort of about that really, and these very different, you know, so it's pulling from, they're the sort of micro ways of looking at it. And the macro it's about class and race and colonialism and empire and patriarchy, really, in this country.
Yeah, I think that tells all of the amazing themes, and I'm really excited to talk to you about that idea of silence, which but yeah, we must get onto that. Before we do, I'd really love it if you could read a very short extract for us to give us a little taster.
Okay. I usually start with the beginning.
Yeah, lovely. But
I've done that before, and I thought I'd actually do something completely different for you, actually. That's all right.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, happy.
So this is from Tamara's point of view, and perhaps we'll talk a bit more about point of view later, because it's really been an important part and integral to this book, I think, certainly in the writing of it. So, holding hands, they dig their toes into the pebbles and climb up the bank. The shingle shifts, tips and rolls under them, inching them back as they struggle forward. At the top, they turn and see the others in miniature, still sat behind the stripy windbreak in their deck chairs drinking tea. The sea has been dragged out as if trapped by its own tide. Today has been a brilliant day. Ice cream, Mummy is there, songs in the car, legs sticky on the hot back seat, sandwiches and flask of tea, bottle of squash already made up. Bikini for Mummy, swimsuit for her, Nan and Grandad. Still holding hands, they walk towards a huge bowl that's standing up on its side. It's not shiny, but it's a mirror, the mother says. A mirror to capture sound, like a net for fish. Her mother lifts her onto her shoulders and tells her to listen. What can she hear? Everything, she says. Yes, says her mother. A whole world of noises comes across the sea and is caught by the sound mirror. Can you hear them speaking in French, in Punjabi, in Italian? They giggle. Can you hear elephants rumbling, mice squeaking? Her mother puts her down, sends her 20, 32 steps more away. Whisper a secret and we'll see what I can hear. She does. Her mother gasps and her mouth pretends a shocked oh. Running to her, she picks her up and swings her around. The marram grass slices at ankles. Her mother's fingers press hard against her ribs, almost tickling. The sound mirror reflects Nana calling for them to come back. They hide, crouch in the grass, fingers over grinning lips. A seagull with stiff yellow legs watches them, its head cocked to one side. Nana huffs over the hill. There you are. Come on, we're going for fish and chips. She runs to her Nana, takes her hand, leaves her mother behind. We found a mirror, Nana. It keeps secrets. So you did. Bloody useless, ugly things. And about time they pulled them down. That's it.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing that you've chosen that extract, I think, because obviously, as you were saying, we only hear that in between generation, the mother of Tamara, in the other people's voices as dialogue rather than in her own narrative. And that's actually quite a positive memory, and many of the memories of her aren't so positive. And that kind of silencing of her, that must have been a big decision for you to decide not to give her a perspective. How did you come to that decision?
It's quite complex. I think in giving her a perspective, it almost flattens and reduces her. And what I think is really interesting is to see someone from everyone else's different perspective, especially because it does shift through time. And she is a complex character. There are moments when she is loving and glorious and wonderful, and moments when she is absolutely not. And I think if we were to be in her perspective, it would almost it would undo the effect of how she is seen from different areas, because we're almost too close to her then. And so what I want is for us to be very much in Tamara's mindset, really, because Tamara is really the central focus. She's the point that everyone else is moving around or trailing behind, is probably a better way to put it, or they collect up in her. And I think if we heard Gail, then she would explain herself in a way that would almost undo Tamara and the others. And so she becomes the knot that the others are tying into. So undoing her reduces her somehow. She does this because, she's doing this because, oh, she's so angry because. And I also think it's really important, I did this with Wounding as well, where the woman is talked about, not she has no voice, because that reflects and is an idiom of how society still is. You see things and women, feminism, do we need it? Yeah, we do. And women are still silenced, whether it's from threats of violence and name calling on Twitter, or because we still have an internal sense of shame and fear. I mean, I know for a fact, I don't say things as freely and openly about my thoughts and feelings as either the men in my life do, or men I admire and converse with on Twitter or other social media. They are far more open because I am frightened. Or when, the lockdown, people talk about going out on their walks. It's been too hot to take my dog on a walk. I won't walk. Yeah. And some of that will be particular to me, but the world is still frightening for women, and we are often silenced. And so it feels that it's sort of a metaphor or a metonym for how a lot of us feel.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because I think you're also, by talking about that, you're touching on all of the other things that the class, the race, all of these things where people's voices are marginalized and not listened to. And I think it's a conversation that we're so desperately trying to have right now, and that this book very much feels a part of. And Ada, the grandmother who's originally from India, and who comes to England sort of escaping the collapse of the British Raj, is fascinating as well, because she gets marginalized. Well, she's beautiful, which kind of and she's got fair skin, which saves her from being pushed into being, you know, the other, but she's still called exotic, and she's kind of almost forced into this kind of sexualized persona, which luckily she embraces to some extent and manipulates as well. But it's also terrifying that she's forced to do that. And the book, I think, really brilliantly expresses that difficulty. And there are some conversations where you're just like, oh, you know, wow. And I've heard those conversations, and it's the silences that I don't know if you've read Real Life yet by Brandon Taylor. It's on the Booker list this year, and I think you would love it for exactly what you're talking about, this way in which we think so hard before we open our mouths. And we're constantly reading how it is other people are going to react, and thinking about, what truth do I tell? What do I withhold? And I think this is a conversation that your book is having. And it's partly around intimacy as well. I feel that a lot of the characters in the book struggle, in a sense, with that concept of intimacy, whether it be with relationships, with family, with, you know, just that sense of belonging. It feels like they all want to belong, and they're all blocked, and they're all kind of hitting something. So Claire is up against her family, reject her because she has a baby young and out of wedlock, and that's it. They just write her off in this.
Yeah, although I think with Claire as well, it's, you know, that classic family entanglement. It's even more complicated. She's like the second, third kid in a massive family. So there's a kind of, she's subsumed by that. There was expectations for what girls would do, mother their siblings in her era. She wasn't particularly attractive, and she was told that, you know. When she's evacuated, she goes to a particularly cruel family. I mean, it's not abuse, but it's pretty mean, it's pretty awful. And then her baby brother dies. They're both ill with diphtheria, but her baby brother dies, and she has a real sense that it should have been her. So it's sort of that it's compounded, that she is ostracized layer by layer by layer, until she falls in love and has a baby, and she has babies. And as a immigrant Roman Catholic Sicilian girl, you know, it's the worst thing she could do. I mean, it was for pretty much most girls back then.
Because she's clearly intelligent, isn't she? And the book explores how bright she is, and how that just isn't an option for her.
Yeah. No, girls like her do not go to the grammar school, even though she could have.
Yeah, but I mean, it's a bit like towards the end, there's this passage where you talk about, or Tamara's thinking about, we all become our mothers eventually, silenced, poisoned with rage, mad with fury, but more than that, so much more. All that we've swallowed, remade, taken in our stride, so much more than that. And it feels like they're all swallowing stuff. They're all like, just say, okay, just gonna get on with that. And on top of that, with this whole DNA working behind Tamara, this whole, you know, these people inside of her that contain all of the histories and all of the mothers that went before. There's also, she decides, is this a teaser, is this a spoiler? If I say what she decides, will I ruin it? She decides that she doesn't want to have any more babies. I put it out there. And that's also a comment on, not only on ending that line, which, as you say, she's kind of trailing all of this stuff behind her. It's all leading up to her. And then she decides that that's it, end the line. But also it's that sense that that's all a woman can be. So she's there, and the doctor's trying to persuade her she should keep going, you know. You're too young.
Yeah, that kind of kept, there's lots of that in the book, but I don't try to make too much of it, but I hope I just embed it or embody it in the book, which is, you know, the menopause, menarche, motherhood or not, motherhood is as a source of pleasure, motherhood is not. Motherhood is duty, sex is pleasure. Because what I find, womanhood is about so many things, you know, it's gender, it's sex, and I'm not getting into any about biology and what that means, because that I just find such a toxic conversation and so exclusive. But often the discussion about what it is to be female or a woman in our society, if we take that kind of stereotypical idea, is so limited. It's this, and so what I've tried to do, even just with these very, you know, small cast of characters, is show just how diverse that experience is. So, you know, if we were to bring up the sort of fairly limited sort of toxic conversations that happen about what comprises a woman, it's like a fucking great deal. So, you know, it's about being a human being, but it's politics and society places these structures around our bodies. And so, yeah, she decides to cut it off. But you're right, it is about being a woman in this society, but it's also about invoking a kind of blood sacrifice, an ending, a cutting off point, a kind of a fury. She's like a modern Medea. She doesn't kill her children, she kills the potential.
But it's brilliant because it has all of that in it. And I think with the Indian history as well, the idea of Kali and the destruction and the chaos. And for me, I had this really interesting conversation with a writer called Shah Hussain, who's, there's just a new edit of the Virago Book of Witches, which she did. And her introduction is so interesting because it's looking at how society just decided to create the witch as a way of kind of like coping with the Madonna. That suddenly, if you're not the Madonna, you're the witch, and just kind of re-owning that really rich heritage of all of the different things that we can be is so brilliant. And I think it definitely feels like that's happening with her. But there's other things as well in that idea. So for those of you who don't know, the novel opens with Tamara going to kill her mother today. And actually the first line is, she is going to kill her mother today. And this idea of killing is really there. Like her mother said to her, Gail said to her, you know, when you have a baby, you're killing yourself. So she's kind of traumatized by this idea that she's already killed something already. It's like she's murdering her mother more than once. But then on top of that, there's also, at the beginning, you also talk about history. You imagine history trails you like clanging tin cans on a wedding car, but you're wrong. History is a halter that leads. We're beasts of burden with a ring through our nose. You go where we lead. We are not whole, we are fragments, ununified, unstable entities colliding under the swirling universe, overflowing with memories and feelings not our own, archives of those who came before. It's almost romantic imagining we're individuals cut off from the rest, making ourselves feel special. What we are is the story she is made of. You then go on to talk about free will, but I think what is so fascinating about that, and about some of the things that Tamara not only embodies with that DNA swirl, but is also, when she talks about communion, she reaches it through drugs, through kind of like MDA, a sense of connecting to the universe. And it felt very much to me that this book really is a discussion about what does it mean to be an individual, and what it means to just be a part of this kind of experience that in a sense we're tiny dots in. I wondered if you could, I don't know if you can say anything to that. It's a difficult thing to just throw out there.
I do think that where we have gone horribly wrong in the global north in particular is the cult of the individual. And I think the reason I think we know it, and you know, it has implications financially, politically, morally. But I think where it frightens us is if we start to question about why do we do what we do, who are we undo so much of our kind of Western ideas of selfhood. But we also have to start rethinking the judicial process, and you know, who's culpable for what, and what does this mean? You know, I think if we're really honest with ourselves, to find a kind of locus of absolute selfness is almost impossible. Why do you think what you think? Why do you like what you like? How do you know you won't like that? When were you exposed to this? How do you know you think? How do you know you are what you are? And it's all far too complicated to sort of sum up in a pithy statement. But I think we are so desperately lonely, and you're right that they are individuated and therefore seeking intimacy in many different ways and belonging, because we venerate the idea of the individual. Whereas if we thought more about the colony, the group, the kinship, Donna Haraway talks about this beautifully, kinship and family and what that means. And, you know, the protection of there will always be people with more power than others, but the hierarchy that we live in now is just absurd. It's absurd. And it's killing us, and it's killing people. You know, I saw something on Twitter today, someone arguing that a black woman was talking about how she had been stopped by the police again. And this person, it's not because of your race. It's like, just listen. How do you know? Who are you to say, like, we're not listening because we've decided in our own little spaces, I'm right, because our ego, but I understand why we do that. There's an ego in that, there's a fear, we're afraid because we haven't been allowed to just rely on the collective. And I'm not suggesting there's a kind of utopia in that at all. But what we're in right now isn't right either.
Yeah. One of the other questions I wanted to ask you kind of relates to that, which is what you say in the back. Well, it's kind of, I guess it's in a sense what you have at the beginning as well, because you start with a quote, well, by, I don't know if I'm saying, is it Jean or Jean, Janae? Jean. Well, you start with Jean, but you move on to Jacques. And then at the back, well, the Jacques Derrida quote is, what cannot be said above all must not be silent, but written. And then at the end, you also talk about, just now I'm flicking through my Mark Fisher, and this kind of this sense of hauntology. And I know that you've talked a bit about the book being that, and in a weird sense, I suppose all that sound kind of reflected back from the past is definitely there in the book. But there's also, I think, a sense in what you just said now, and indeed in the book as well, about this feeling of, in a way, a disappointment, like we're haunted by what we could have become, but we haven't. Yeah.
That's exactly
and I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. Yeah.
It's about, so hauntology, Mark Fisher talks about it beautifully, and I think his loss is a huge loss to us all intellectually. He just could write about so brilliantly on so many subjects, you know, on music, on all kinds of, he's just brilliant. Anyway, he writes about hauntology, and of course he is thinking about Derrida's theories about hauntology, which comes from Spectres of Marx, which I'm not going to quote from because I can't right now. But it's not just being haunted by the past, it's being haunted by a future that will not come. And it's that kind of that multiplicity, or the future that you've chosen this, so this won't come. It's about this temporal uncertainty, this sort of, we are radically embedded in the now, and yet are so anxious by this temporal spread, if you like. And I just think that's so I think as humans, that's just so interesting for us. Mm. And I know dread, isn't that what existential dread is? If you were just thinking about, I'm hungry, I need to eat, I'm doing this, need to get some shelter, driven by an impulse to reproduce, if you were, you know, is that not what existential dread is? Being so aware of your position in your temporality.
yeah, I sometimes wish I didn't have that. Um,
What is the
but
habit?
but time was something I know you were really interested in, and perhaps for those of you who don't know, Heidi actually did a podcast while she was making this book called First Drafts, which I was lucky enough to be on, but so were many others. And they're not only conversations with other writers and other creatives, but also there was a kind of mapping of the process of creating the book. And one of your episodes was about the idea of time. And I wondered if you could talk to us a bit about how that factored into the way that you wanted to create this book.
Yeah, that's a really great question. Thank you. So I guess one of the things that this all starts with is theories around trauma and how intergenerational trauma repeats itself either through this is all still very new and we're still finding new things, but you know, via testimony, conditioning, behaviors, but also by changes, epigenetics, so changes to our DNA. Which makes sense if you think about it. If someone has experienced trauma and survived it, their responses may be very useful for their future offspring. So to shy away from something that has created problems or to be afraid of. This has enormous repercussions on individuals, but also entire groups of people. If you think about enslaved peoples who were abducted to live in an entirely different continent, they've experienced enormous trauma. This will have massive implications on entire groups of people, women included. So it starts with that. And trauma, PTSD proper, or when it's complicated even more so, really we can sort of think about it in lots of ways, but for me the central factor is time is utterly ruptured and shattered. There isn't anything linear. The past intrudes, sometimes in very damaging, disruptive, deeply affecting ways. It never leaves a person. It will they can be entirely immersed back into the past, just like that, because of a smell, because of a sound, because of a word. And so I was trying to, when I was thinking about this, like, how do I do this? And I also wanted to sort of experiment with how, if I tell things in the past tense, how do I make it clear that it's still resonating and echoing now? So everything is told in the present, but not in that. This is where your education is far better. I know there will be a term for this. It's not that she is now running. Oh, she is breathing. Oh, look to the side. It's not that. It's a little.
Not continuous present. Yeah.
Thank you, darling. Yeah, it is.
I hope.
But it's in a present tense, which you guys would have heard from when we read that. I read the extract, and then Rebecca did too. Where it's clear that the stories are unfolding together, even though they're set in, variously in from the 40s up till, early 21st century, and Tamara very much in the present day. But also for Tamara in particular, because she's the one who's really damaged by things, she moves back and forth all the time, whereas the grandmother's lives are fairly linear. Even though they're in the present, we move with them. I also thought it was really important to have the present tense, because then you're feeling what the character's feeling in that moment.
Yeah.
Whereas if I said to you, when I was a little girl, I used to, it's like, what do I remember? That's my adult perception.
Yeah.
So it's about sort of encountering them in those moments and seeing the world as they're seeing them. But very much for Tamara, it was trying to use form to mirror the content, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I do. And I think what's really interesting about our lived experience is that even though we're constantly reshaping the past, in the sense that we recontextualize it all the time, it bursts through, and it may be, and it's the context of when it bursts through. Do you know what I mean? So even though we re-experiencing that moment, we re-experiencing it with different eyes at the same time. It's a weird kind of, so I think you definitely feel that sense with Tamara. And I mean, if people don't cry in this book at least once, I'll be very disappointed in them. Because I think you've created three very visceral, very real characters. None of them always do everything that one might agree with, but then whoever does that, you know, they feel real, they feel so real, and their experience sometimes hurts, which is a good thing. I mean, you know, in a weird way, I think, you know, no one reads a book, well, maybe people do, but generally I don't read a book just to get a kind of pat on the back and to feel good about my life.
No.
You want to be pushed a bit, you want to be questioned a bit, you want to rethink certain things. And there are a couple of other things that I do want to talk to you about, which is this idea of, we've talked about a little bit about, but this the shame as well, which feels very wrapped up in how other people interpret us. And in a strange way, this book is, well, and also I think how we look at ourselves and how we judge our own choices and our and what's, in a way, what's been done to us and how we've responded to what's been done to us, which isn't always necessarily riddled with fault, and yet we take the guilt and we feel the shame of that. And there's, yeah, very much I feel that Tamara's kind of almost constantly dealing with that. And well, not just her, others as well. And I wondered how you felt about that idea of shame and how it works in the book.
I think shame is something that, I mean, let's just, even without any terrible traumas, until very recently, and certainly when I was a girl, which wasn't that long ago, I remember feeling terrible shame around my periods.
Yeah.
And recently, a guy I hardly know said something to me about, oh yeah, my wife's really suffering with her periods, and she's had this terrible, and I was a bit, because I'm not used to men I don't have a relation, like, it was wonderful, don't get me wrong, it was one, I was like, yeah, let's have a talk about women's bodies together, like, yeah, oh gosh, that's, you know, but, and I know a lot of women will get this, that hiding, when you're a girl, hiding your tampons on your sandwich towel, up your sleeve to go to the toilet, the shame of, so that's the kind of, if there's that, then it's shame about our sexuality. I'm always still in awe of how males, you know, you hear about, they get, whatever it might be, but they chat about how they masturbate, or they chat about porn or whatever, and not all men, of course, but there's a kind of, this is what I want, this is what gives me pleasure, this is what, whereas, and again, this is changing and that's wonderful, but I was certainly raised with terrible shame about sex at all. The having of it, the enjoying it, the wanting it, and even as a grown adult woman, I still am very like, oh, I are we talking about that? And I wouldn't dream of saying, you know what, I'd love to go jogging and do this. I wouldn't dream of even thinking outside those boxes because of shame, because that's what society's sort of been teaching us. And then add to that, if you've been abused in any way, shape or form, and, you know, society until very recently, and it isn't changing quickly enough, blames the victim for that. Well, what did you do? What were you wearing? Yeah. And if it happens more than once to you, which has happened to me, I was abused as a child on more than one occasion by more than one person, sexually, and, you know, beaten up by various fathers and things, father figures and what have you. When I was then raped by a boyfriend at 15, it was my fault. He could see that I was disgusting and that that's what I deserved. And I still carry that. Yeah. Even now, there will be people that I can't, or situations where I can feel myself not looking at them, shying away. And this is hard to talk about, but I want to talk about because I think it's so fucking important. Because regardless of everything that I have and the people that love me, I still hold a terrible sense that I don't deserve any of it.
How are you going to make me cry now?
People keep quoting the book of me and I don't recognise it because I've not read it since I wrote it. And someone else is saying about, oh, it must have been really beautifully edited. No, I wrote this like this. I played about with some of the, some sentences and how I interleaved it, but this is pretty much how it just came out. And I haven't read it because it makes me cry, because, and as I say, it's fiction, but it's an auto-fiction really. And it doesn't even tell half of it. So I can't read a lot of it because it makes me cry again. But it feels really important to say it and to get it out there and to do it.
Yeah. And I also, I mean, listeners might know, might not know that Heidi is a very dear friend of mine, and I sent you a note because I believe that you deserve everything that you have, and this book is really beautiful, and you should feel immensely proud of the book and of yourself. And I think that, you know, yeah, it comes back to silence, doesn't it? This idea that we keep quiet, and is something which is so strong. I mean, particularly in British culture, the idea that you just get on with it, you just carry on, and that's experienced in all of these characters. You can see them just being told and getting that sense that they have to just control this part of themselves because you know, it's not going to be accepted by other people, and they just have to get on with it. And the book does talk about mental illness as well, and struggling with accepting the lot you've been ascribed effectively. And yeah, I think I'm so glad that you wrote it.
Thank you.
I was trying to come up with something clever to say there, but
no, I thought it was very clever. But you're right. The silencing, like, because one of the characters are Gail, Tamara, Claire, Ada, which is, you know, the components for DNA, GTCA. But Claire most certainly suffers from a mental health issue. She's very poorly throughout the book and tries very hard to control it. But the shame isn't always from very extreme things. Like you say, it could be because you are working class and people have told you shouldn't speak like that, or you know, and then it comes back to language, as you said. So, you know, the character Ada outwardly has everything. She's very well educated, as often happens to the Anglo-Indian community. They live between Indian people and native Indians and the Raj, the British, and they often, you know, the person this is based on had the most beautiful RP. With some of this is very based about, when I first met her, she said, corrected how I spelt my name, and I said it's a H, because I thought that was how you say it. It's a H, isn't it? And she said, "Oh, darling, it's an H. It's an H." This is like the second thing we'd said to each other. We'd just met. And I, you know, was an autodidact, and I remember saying hyperbole, hyperbole, superlative, not superlate, you know. But to be fair to her, she was watching her language all the time, because she could slip with using words that were, even though she had this beautiful accent and she looked a certain way, she sat beautifully and knew all the manners, knew everything to fit, all the codes. She might slip up by talking about going to living on the colony, not in, I can't think what their word is at the Raj, but the Raj had their name for where they lived, cantonment, and then where the Anglo-Indians lived. So if she said, not everyone would know it, but if she said, "Oh, my father, yes, he worked for the Raj and the railways," everyone would be like, what did he? You know, there were ways of slipping. So even language is more than just how we speak or what, there are so many ways that it encodes us into our belongings, and people will pick you up, and shame is built into that, how we use language. Again, whether we're using it at all. So yes.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the other really beautiful things about the book, is that they each have a very distinct voice, and that is to do with the language that they choose to use and that you've chosen to give them, and that comes across. I mean, you know, it's how we immerse ourselves in them, but it's also quite a difficult thing to achieve, you know, from the author's perspective. And I think you've done it so beautifully. They each feel so distinct. Yeah, it's a really great achievement. I could go on talking to you just on and on. And I hope we've covered some of it. We haven't really talked about lies, but we have talked about that when we spoke previously before, this idea of within the fiction is the truth, and all of that kind of thing. So I suppose, oh gosh, yeah, I'm just looking at my notes thinking there's loads of stuff I could have asked you, but I don't want to talk too long.
Do two more. Give me 2 more.
Okay, so yeah, I wanted to ask a bit more about that beginning, because we talked about the Jacques Derrida quote. What about the Jean Genet? It's a true image born of a false spectacle. And I think this is you a little bit again, going back to that autofiction in a sense, but tell us a bit more about that.
I think, do you know, when I was going to say, you published the first edition of The Mesmerist Daughter. That's a silly question. I think I've been really interested, even as a very, very little girl. I remember listening to my grandmother and my aunts and my mother all talking, and I remember thinking, their words don't match what they're trying to say, and being really aware of the shifting, what's true, what's being said, and this sort of shifting diagram, if you like. And so that when I wrote The Mesmerist Daughter, I say, my mother was a wolf. Now that is true, and again, that's autofictive to a certain, well, sort of. It's just taken from one image and that I thought when I was a kid, but it was true. My mother was a wolf. That's the only way to have understood the way she behaved. It isn't a fact. It's not a fact. Unfortunately, because I would love to be able to, transmute and become, metamorphose into anything I liked. Wouldn't that be amazing? It isn't a fact, but it is true. And it's, for me, there are certain things that fiction can do. These falsities, they can tell a much stronger emotional truth. It gets to a deeper core, because, and also it's about metaphor, it's about language. Language is always artificial. This idea, I really can't stand and quite vociferously hate when people go, just strip it all back, like language just needs to be. No, actually, language always teeters on an edge of misapprehension, of misunderstanding, and what we're hearing and cognition, and it's always teetering. This idea that anything could be purely flat, but it's also really fucking dull. So, my mother, when I was 4, was quite a difficult person. She could be very, very lovely, and then could be absolutely cruel and appalling and frightening. I didn't know how, do you want to read that? No, I'd rather read My Mother Was a Wolf.
Yeah.
Do you know?
Yeah, no, totally. It's, when I think about language in my head, I imagine crevices opening up, like just big, deep kind of cracks in the earth that just split right open. And language is the thing that tries to somehow go over the top. Like it cannot get the whole crevice, but it's doing its best to get there as best as possible. Like it's constantly stepping over that liminal, awkward, unknown, silent space all the time.
Yeah, the abyss. It's the abyss, absolutely.
But what else do we have?
Yeah, and exactly. But it means though that we've sort of, and it's got to sound ridiculous for someone whose entire life and living is made up with words and how they're read and perceived and writing them, and we attach so much to it that, again, it comes down to our kind of individual, and attach so much to our human cognition and the tools we use. It's a technology, it's a tool. And it can be very, very useful, but it can also be incredibly difficult and damaging and challenging and if you misinterpret it, that can be incredibly damaging. I mean, that feeling that we all have of going home and thinking, oh God, did I say that? Are they going to think I meant that? Yeah. That's just part of our daily interaction, isn't it? That fear of anxiety of being misunderstood. And that's why you constantly aim
to make your language more descriptive, and if necessary, therefore more florid if needs be. Not purple passages, but careful attention to detail that expresses things as nearly as possible to the feelings, emotions, thoughts that are all bubbling up.
Exactly. Yeah, so that you're absolutely right, and it isn't about being florid and purple prose, but it is about careful attention. And I think that's what writing does. You have to pay, and reading, you are paying careful attention. Simone Weil talks about how attention is the greatest gift, and I think that's absolutely right. It's like a very profound thing to pay close attention and to look carefully and closely. And that is the kind of counter to the people that are sort of anti, like, oh, you're so PC, you're limiting what we can say. No, it's not actually. Your shortcuts in language are limits. Paying careful attention and being and thinking about what your words do. You know that bullshit, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. Well, fuck that. The words have hurt me. I've been, it's not a pleasant thing to recall being punched in the face or thrown down the stairs or what have you, but that's all right. I haven't spent any money on going to a therapist about that, but I have spent a lot of money and time with my therapist talking about how my mother said, I wish it was you that was dead, or I don't want to be your mother anymore, or don't call me mummy, I'm not her anymore, she's dead. Like, they're the things that hurt you.
Yep.
Language is then that's the thing, it's sort of it's a paradox. It's so important for us as humans, and yet it's tremulous.
Yeah, you're giving me goosebumps. I'm loving talking to you, Heidi. So I want to ask about what you're doing. I know you've already started another book. I know you're a big worker. So you're back into something new. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to, but
I am. I am actually. I haven't. We've talked about this before. My work process isn't that I start writing immediately, but I think and research and play with ideas, and I just sit in it. And sometimes that can take a year almost, but then I write really fast. So, I was thinking about the Sound Mirror for, maybe a year or so. I wrote a short story about playing with some of it, and then I wrote something else, and then it came together in 3 months, just like bang. And that's been true with the others. But this, something I want it to be more horror. I mean, a lot of my work is fairly uncomfortable anyway, but I want this to be sort of fairly blatant. And it's about, at the moment, this could change. This would be an interesting thing to sort of hold it up against. It's about someone who is a deep ecologist, so a biologist, comes back from somewhere where there's been something with eco-piracy. She comes back, she moves into this extraordinary, beautiful big house with lots of land around it. The villagers wonder why she's there. Her friends are even like, how the hell has she afforded this? So there's this kind of ambiguity. And then she begins to, and then it will feel, I think, that she's a victim of hauntings and folk horror, but maybe the boundaries are just dissolving. And see, it's a kind of eco folk horror, boundary shifting. Think Ovid crossed with nature writing, straw man, folk horror, feminist.
Yeah, think amazing. That's why I'm sold.
So I'm still kind of thinking, like, just what do they do to each other? But yeah, so I've just been like really digging myself into what trees do and how trees communicate and how.
Oh, that's fabulous, isn't it?
Yeah, and reptiles and insects and so.
Well, that sounds absolutely amazing. And I know that this is part of the Sound Mirror, is part of your publisher's year of publishing women, isn't it?
Yeah.
So that's exciting too. And how many more have they got to come?
Another 2.
Brilliant. And
so
if anyone's interested, they should go to the Bluemoose website, shouldn't they, and check them all out.
Yeah. They're fantastic. It's really exciting, actually. It's a really lovely thing to be a part of.
It's absolutely brilliant, and a perfect book to come out with that as an idea, I think. So that's very exciting too. I'm wishing you all the luck for the not the booker. I've got every hair follicle crossed, you know, all that. And I'm really looking forward to the next one. And I just want to say thank you so much for coming in and talking to us and sharing your brilliant work. And yeah, we'll go out and buy it, everyone. Come on, this is what it looks like. If you're lucky, you might get a signed copy. And they're available now, aren't they, from Bluemoose right now?
And various Waterstones have some signed copies. The one in Sutton, the one in Harrogate will have after this weekend. The Book Corner in Halifax. Yeah, I'm doing a little thing up north. There's a few around before you go down to Brighton. So there are signed copies out there, and some of the signed copies will have a little "you will know" to message me. There's like some secret ones, and there are extras. So if you message me, you'll get a little extra as well. But thank you.
Exciting.
It's a pleasure, and thank you. It's lovely to talk about something that's so, you know, a lot of you gets poured into a book, so it's lovely to talk about it with someone who reads so carefully and thoughtfully. So thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute delight, and thank you, Heidi. And yeah, I don't know who I'll be interviewing next, but I'm just very excited to have seen you. So I could end there, really. Anyway, thank you, and I'm okay.